and I want to send you some beauty if it's in my power at all today. I think this conversation is beautiful, so I didn't make it, but I send it to you. All right, be well.
Hi, Ezequiel. Thank you so
Hi.
much for taking the time to speak to me and come on the podcast.
My pleasure.
As you know, I've been really interested in your work for quite some time and trying to keep up with also the current research you're doing and the enactive approach,
Mm.
which I hope we get to talk about some of these things. But I wanted to start and go a little bit back to maybe the roots of the enactive approach and the roots of your own thinking in the work of Francisco Varela, and especially his book, Principles of Biological Autonomy, that you've recently re-edited, republished with together with Evan Thompson, which is great because it was since the publication in 19, I think it was 79.
Mm.
I think it was out of print actually.
Yes, it was very, very hard to get that book. I never owned the copy myself. I had a photocopy that I got when I was a student. And then when I tried to buy one, the copies were so expensive.
I was also because I was getting into Varela's work in my master's, and I was
Yeah.
looking for a copy because I always want to read books in sort of.
Yeah,
I was like, yeah, that's too expensive for
that's
us.
true. That's true. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Um, yes,
yeah.
I'd be curious to know about your first encounter with the book. If you, I don't
Mm.
know if there's like a moment you can pinpoint.
Yeah, this is a good starting point because I wasn't aware of this work until I started doing my PhD at the University of Sussex. I was doing my PhD in what was then called the School of Cognitive Sciences, Cognitive and Computing Sciences, which was a very special place because it was very interdisciplinary. You would share offices with psychologists, linguists, roboticists, AI people, and so on. And one of the founders was Margaret Bowden. So many people there, um, enjoy some sort of a challenging and free discussions and debates. Let's put it like that. Um, and it was then that people started to mention ideas such as autopoiesis. I believe it was Mike Wheeler actually who gave a seminar introducing the concepts of autopoiesis, autopoiesis for the under fives. That was the title of the seminar. And at that point, I was already reading some of Maturana and Varela, and it was a bit of a bet. I had to imagine that I had to go through this very difficult, convoluted language, this obscure prose, because probably at the end of it, the idea is there will be a payoff, or I will be transformed by the process of reading it in such a way that things would make sense to me. And I wouldn't say that they made total sense to me, but I could see the potential. And then I started just tracing anything I could get by these authors. And then, of course, the library of Sussex had a copy of Principles of Biological Autonomy, and that's an interesting book because you cannot really guess from the publication dates because Autopoiesis and Cognition, the book written by Varela and Maturana, appears in 1980 in English. But in fact, it was written before. It was written in the mid 70s, more or less.
And was it in Spanish, the original?
There was a version in Spanish, the Máquinas y Seres Vivos,
Okay.
published in Chile. But there was a version in English before the Spanish version in terms of
Yeah.
reports of the technical reports of the what's it called the computing lab in University of Illinois. So all of that seems like okay. Well, this idea seems all these books are appearing more or less at the same time, but in fact, autopoiesis and cognition is a bit like a first stage, which in the book Principles of Biological Autonomy, Varela picks up on that, and in fact, several of the first chapters are kind of repeating, going over again with slight changes, but going over again the main points of the theory of autopoiesis. But at that point, there's also in Varela there's a need to move in other directions. he had interest in try to formalize some of these ideas using formal systems, mathematics, and so on, category theory. And he wanted to apply this in a more open-ended manner because the theory of autopoiesis was becoming too self-enclosed. I would say, this is my opinion. In any case, not everybody will probably agree with it, in the sense that it was talking to itself in circles and circles and so on. And Varela had a more, I would say, exploratory spirit as a scientist. I think he wanted to look at examples in biological systems such as the immune system, um, neural oscillations, things like that, and the biology of the cell and the extracellular matrix, things like that. So, so the book is this moment of departure from a more abstract beginnings. This doesn't mean, Varela was also an experimental neuroscientist, and so was Maturana, but the theory itself was rather abstract, and putting them together back into work. And in doing this, he also kind of sets on his own course, and towards the end of the book, you start reading something about naturalized epistemologies and things like that that are very reminiscent, with hindsight, that are very reminiscent of what we talk about in the enactive approach of the last couple of decades. So that's a little bit about the book. And of course, for me, it was very inspiring. It was like, not the mathematical part, because I was not really able to apply it directly. I mean, I could follow it, but it was not like, okay, it was too abstract. But the third part of the book was quite novel to me, because he was seeing autonomy as generalization of the idea of autopoiesis, which means like the self-production of a living cell, the self-production, self-distinction of a living cell. He says, like, well, there are many systems that are similar in what they do in self-individuating in different domains, and yet he was very cautious of applying the idea of autopoiesis directly to the systems, like many people were very tempted to do, like, the recurrent patterns in family relations, for instance. There will be people, psychotherapists, who say, "Oh, the family is an autopoietic system." And he said, "No, this is not precise. We need another concept." And that was his proposal in this book, the concept of autonomy, which then is very influential later on down the line for enactivists. So yeah, I think it was time for this book to become more available again. And the idea came to not just reissue the book, but essentially introduce it with some essays and lots of margin annotations, there are about 200 of them, that connect the ideas in the book with later developments in Varela's work, but also contemporaneous interests and concerns in biology, in ecology, in psychology, neuroscience, and so on. So that's the purpose of the new edition.
That's great. I think it only came out a couple of weeks ago, and now it's
Indeed, I only got my see if I can show it my personal copy a few days ago. I mean, I don't know why it took so long, but
it's bigger than I
had
expected. But that's
this stuff with the annotations on the side to
Mhm.
clarifications and things like that.
I only had time to read the introduction
Mm.
and also the nice foreword by Amy Cohen Varela.
Yes, yes.
You and Evan Thompson in the introduction talk about this as a kind of an active urtext, or maybe you can think about the book as
Yes.
introducing many concepts that have become really central in the enactive approach. First and foremost, the idea of autonomy. So can you give a rough, maybe explanation of the idea of autonomy, and also how it
Yeah.
relates to this idea of organizational closure or operational closure?
Yes. Yes. Sure. Okay. Well, as I said, the idea of autonomy is a generalization of the idea of autopoiesis. Maybe if I say what autopoiesis is very quickly, it would be easier to understand autonomy. So autopoiesis was proposed as a kind of organization that a system can have, such that it continues to produce and maintain this same organization. It's a bit of a circular idea. But with that, the point was to try to capture the the constant self-production and self-distinction properties of living organisms. We are made of stuff that that is constantly flowing through our bodies. And at the same time, we're not just simply made, like produced, but we also distinguished from the environment. In the case of a single cell, there is the production of this membrane and the cytoskeleton and things like that. And even now we know that there are processes that are similar to some kind of immune system at the level of a single cell and so on. All of those things are trying to work such that the cell doesn't quite dissolve into the environment, that's become indistinct.
Mhm.
So, as I was saying, this is a very interesting and powerful idea that comes from a tradition of systems thinking in cybernetics. Um, and for that, I use the word organization. Essentially, what matters here in the autopoietic theory that an organization is what is conserved and is tied to the identity of the living organism. Identity in several senses, but in maybe the most important one being that the identity of the organism as such, that we know that it's the same because it's conserving its organization, it would be kind of a token identity. Um, so, but you might say, but isn't the organism constantly changing? Indeed. So what's changing is not the organization, but what they call the structure. So they present these two concepts, structure and organization, as dual concepts. One kind of needs the other to be properly defined. So say, well, changes in structure can happen all the time, provided that you remain autopoietic, then there's no problem. So all the phenomena of life that we normally are interested in, like growth, reproduction, cognition, and so on, these are manifested as changes in the structure, plastic changes in interactions with the environment. What characterizes the organization is what sometimes is called organizational closure or operational closure, which is this self-reference that I was saying earlier, that the organization is such that the processes that form the organized network operate in such a way that they result in the reinstantiation of the whole network. I mean, there's some circularity there. And that's the idea of closure comes from mathematics. It doesn't mean that the system is closed to the environment.
Yeah.
So autonomy essentially is imagine that story told not necessarily at the level or in the domain of molecular interactions that happen in the level of the cell, of the living cell, but told in other domains. The interactions between um, antigens and the immune system, and the immune system with itself can also be understood as a closed network that is sustained in itself. And this is an idea that then Varela connects
Mhm.
to existing work on immune networks. That was very interesting and quite radically different from the traditional perspective. So you could apply this idea in different places, and what Varela proposes is what he calls the closure thesis. It says, well, in
Mhm.
order to tell that a system is autonomous in this technical sense, it's enough to see or to ask whether the system is operationally closed, whether we find in it this organization that I was talking about that is circular. So that's a little bit the rough. There are lots of technical details, but that's a little bit the rough idea of autonomy in this technical sense. I have to emphasize because, of course, the idea of autonomy is broader than this.
I think it also has been developed also in many different ways in the
Yes.
approach that I guess we will talk about uh,
Okay.
as well. Yeah, I was interested in that because in the the book The Embodied Mind, in which was I think in 91 with Varela, Evan Thompson and Eleanor Roche,
Mhm.
introduces first this idea of Enaction and the enactive approach, which is, then in the last 2 or 3 decades been developed in various kinds of ways, but they actually don't explicitly, I think, mention this idea of autonomy so much. So I would be curious to understand a bit better the relationship between the autonomy perspective on organisms and the kind of way that it implies of how we think about the relationship between
Yes, sure.
environment and so on. And this idea of that in the enactive approach is called bringing forth the world, right?
Indeed, yes. Okay, so it's a long story, but a couple of things to keep in mind. As you said, I mean, the embodied mind, which is like the founding text of the enactive approach, appears in 1991. It does, I think it doesn't mention the idea of autopoiesis at all. I don't think it even appears in a note. I don't know. And it talks a little, sometimes it talks about autonomous systems. And you might, be forgiven by imagining that, okay, maybe Varela left all that autonomy stuff behind him and then just moved on to something else. But that's not quite true. I mean, in 1991, he also publishes a paper called Organism, Meshwork of Selfless Selves, where it's almost as if there are different births of the enactive thinking. One is the one that faces the cognitive science audience and neuroscience audience and say, look how we have missed understanding cognition from a dynamical, embodied, and experiential perspective, and how important it would be to continue the project of phenomenologists like Maurice Merleau-Ponty in the context of a cognitive science that is dominated by computer metaphors. Okay, and so there is that, and then there is Varela also writing on his own in 1991, and then in 99, in 97 again, a whole sketch of what I often sometimes call an active theory. So you've got an active approach, but there's a theory within the enactive approach which puts together these concepts about autonomy, sense making, agency, blah, blah, blah. So, and he was already sketching that relation. And the two things can only make sense together because you may read the embodied mind and think like, so what do they mean by bringing forth the world? Do they mean it purely in epistemic sense? In a sense of, for instance, yeah, we have different views on the world. If our sensory systems are different, we want to see different things, if we even see things. Well, there's a bit of that, but if you put that in connection with the other stuff that Varela is working on at the same time, you realize that there's a stronger claim. The claim being that I'm going to speak it very, very bluntly. The whole of cognitive science got its problems wrong. The problem of perception being the reconstruction of objective features of the world that then I have to process, and then that fits into some representational economy in my brain and so on. He says organisms don't do that. Organisms are constantly acting in the world, constantly doing stuff. They're not in the business of reconstructing objective features of the world. They can essentially survive and do very well by tuning in their dynamics, their embodied dynamics, to the dynamics of what's relevant to them. And in doing so, they're not just selecting what's relevant out of all possible interactions that they could have. There are only a few that matter to them. They're also changing the world. They're also introducing changes by acting in the world. Ideas that much later, not much later, a few years later, became more popular in biology in terms of niche construction, for instance. The environment is not independent of evolving populations. Well, for the enactive approach, bringing forth the world is another way of saying the environment and the embodied agent are codependent. They're mutually defining and changing themselves ongoingly. And if you get that problem right, then the whole approach implies maybe looking for other things that than necessarily what's happening, whether the brain is representing stuff or reconstructing the world. Maybe the brain has a different business that is doing something else. And that was, if you like, the key idea of the embodied mind. That one, and also the idea that you have to bring lived experience into the fold. You can't just simply later figure out whether this is connected to the way we actually experience our lives as embodied beings. It has to be there from the beginning in terms of shaping the questions we ask, shaping the methodologies we care about, and so on.
Mhm.
But then the other stuff is also there. And I think what happens later, and one of the last papers that Varela wrote uh, in the early 2000s, just before he passed, with Andreas Weber, it's a kind of attempt to bring them together, right? So the idea of autonomy comes back again, autopoiesis, autonomy, and the idea of sense making, if you like, the bringing forth of worlds, that is an activity more than something that happens in my head, and combined with new actors, to put it like this, like the philosophy of Hans Jonas, which is quite important, and so on. So that is the chapter that brings the lines back together. That apparently, if you only read the embodied mind, you may not see how
Right.
everything is connected.
So I read this paper called um, F/Acts. I don't really know how to pronounce this by you,
Just facts.
which I think for me was really helpful in clarifying a little bit this stronger sense of an action that you were talking about. And
Yeah,
I think you mentioned in this paper also this idea that you find in Varela's other work in the 90s, apart from the embodied mind that you mentioned, of this kind of, I think you call it like a dialectical tension between ideas of self-production and self-distinction. And I think for me that was really helpful in also, I mean, it's challenging to think about this in the right kind of way because you're so used to thinking about the organism and the environment on each side, and the idea of them, in a sense, co-constructing each other is
yeah. It's challenging, but after a while, by looking at concrete cases, by looking at, as I was saying, if you look at it in biology, it seems less challenging because you actually see, beavers building dams, changing the landscape, and so on and so forth, and then growing in that changed landscape. Of course, that happens over more than just, it's not just the one organism doing it. So it's cumulative. Um, so you start seeing, once you accept the idea, then you start seeing it, it pops up in many places, from human relations to, microbiology. Now, indeed, but when I think in the 90s, there was a re-edition of the Spanish version of the Autopoiesis book, the Máquinas y Seres Vivos. And at that point, both Varela and Maturana wrote their own introductions, their own, forwards to the word with their own reflections and so on. And Varela does say something like what we were just saying. Say like we started with an idea that he still thinks is correct, but it could be easily interpreted in very internalistic ways. Okay, I'm self-producing and I just get my nutrients from the environment and that's it. And I reject the rest. And my mind is essentially how I cannot distinguish hallucinations from perceptions because all is happening inside me. And he said yeah, that criticism was kind of right because it was easy to get that idea, which is not what I intended.
Mhm.
But he says that since working on an enactive perspective, he wanted to emphasize that there is this historical codependence between agents and environments, that they're mutually defining and building themselves. So, and then that later work, the work that other people have done, myself included, have emphasized that relationality, so that if autonomy becomes relational autonomy because it's constantly being enacted.
Mhm.
That is the nice thing about the word enaction, because you're not just enacting a world of meaning by engaging the world in certain ways, thus transforming it and be the whole transformation being significant for your own viability, for your own continuity. You're also enacting your own body. You're enacting yourself. You're constantly, by doing whatever you're doing, the body becomes, or is in constant becoming itself,
Mhm.
and changing and transforming itself. So you see that we start with ideas that seem to be very locked into a world where things are the way they are and they cannot change, to from there, using the power of some of those ideas, start putting them in a different configuration such that we can understand change, transformation, and in human cases, we can understand how we become together with others, how we participate in ongoing transformation, mutual transformations, and things like that.
Mhm.
So that has been that is a little bit of a sketch of the trajectory of enactive ideas. Um, well, since this book we mentioned the embodied mind and later work. It's an opening up of that initially very self-enclosed
Mhm.
idea
Mhm.
of self-protection, which in some writings I talk about the dialectics of between the two conditions of autopoiesis. I said you're making yourself and you're making yourself different from the other, from the environment. And I say that those two things are not independent, because the conditions that would best satisfy self-production would be that any relation with the environment is useful. You
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
everything is food, so to speak. But if everything is useful, is that you have to accept any interaction with the environment. It's like you're essentially open to the environment.
Mhm.
And the opposite happens if you want to be as, you want to do self-distinction the best possible way. You just build a wall around yourself and do not allow any influence from the outside. But of course, you will die because you cannot get the energy and the nutrients. So each of these two requirements is pointing in opposite directions. And what you need to do is to see this as a dialectic, and the step that overcomes this tension, that keeps the distinction. It
Mhm.
doesn't erase the distinction between the ideas, but now the ideas are working in a new plane, in a new mode. And that, I propose, is the inactive idea of agency and adaptivity, that you're using the environment constantly to build yourself. And in doing so, you build this self distinction, but you're also open,
Mhm.
adaptively. You're trying to conserve certain path of becoming, uh, and that is a little bit the resolution of that initial dialectical tension.
At the, uh, I guess, more existential phenomenological level, this is this idea from Hans Jonas, now this idea of needful freedom,
Yeah,
that both
exactly.
open, but at the same time. I think Andrea also talked about this in another episode.
Yeah,
Um, I think for me, this was really helpful because it really links the idea of autonomy directly to a notion of becoming in the enactive approach. And I think that's some of the one of the themes of your more recent research, from what I could tell, is that you're trying to also make sense of this idea, how it relates to the idea of a body, what a body is, which
yeah.
is actually very hard to say, even though there's all this literature in embodied cognitive science. Um, so can you talk a little bit about
Yeah,
this?
absolutely. Yeah. You're right. I think that, well, you just said it. The question, what what is a body? When we ask that question, in the context of embodied cognitive science, you don't find many clear answers. That is something surprising. I mean, in other areas, in other areas of inquiry, there may be, better some better answers, but it's almost like embodied cognition was trying to say, well, it's almost obvious what the body is. Come on, it's our anatomical, physiological structures, our biological body, our sensor apparatus, blah, blah, blah. Well, yeah, but that doesn't, in my opinion, go deep enough because you may speak of a body of anything like this. A typewriter may have a body in that sense because it has a structure and so on, and it may interact with the world. I don't know. So I think the enactive theory, which I was saying, gives us a lot of tools to try to work out better approaches to a more principled conception of bodies in the plural. I would also say because we end up proposing that we don't have just this one dimension of embodiment. We do have an organic dimension,
Mhm.
our physiology and so on. But we also have a sensorimotor dimension. We are active in the world. We have powers. We can do things. We're sensitive to things and so on. And that seems to be um, not reducible to the biology because, for instance, you also depend on the environment for the possibilities that you can, the affordances you have, the obstacles, and so on and so forth. And then we have a social intersubjective dimension as well. We are again, these dynamics of affirmation, recognition, distinction, they're also happening in this social domain. So we speak of these dimensions of regulations of embodiment, or dimensions of embodiment, and the the fact that tells you that is a good proposal is that these dimensions are sometimes at odds with each other. You know, uh, you may consider that for health reasons you should go on a diet or something like this, but that's something that comes from our linguistic knowledge. We know about it. We're told. Some people give us good arguments. We recognize that that's a good argument and realize reflectively that we should do that. But the sensory motor body doesn't really agree with that. When we see the ice cream, we want to have ice cream. And it's hard to or breaking a bad habit because it could be unhealthy. Like habit of smoking. So that is a telltale sign that is quite right to see that the body is not just this unified thing, even if you want to consider it as a process, it's not just this unified, but it's an entanglement of
Mhm.
different kinds of autonomy. That is what we propose. The idea of autonomy comes back as a proposal. This is a theory, of course, in the sensory motor domain. So we have sensory motor agency, and it comes back in the interaction domain and the linguistic domains. That is a little bit of the enactive trick, if you like. You just see whether in the new domain of interest, something seems to be conserving itself while other things change, and
Mhm.
see if it is possible, or there is evidence that which is conserved might be conceived as an autonomous system.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
Uh, so becoming involves all of these dimensions. It's just not the one dimension. And in here, you mentioned Hans Jonas, which is also he's very useful also to distinguish these forms, transitions in forms of life, from
Mhm.
basic needful freedom to animal life or mobile life, essentially, that you can perceive, you can have different dimensions for your emotional life and so on and so forth, to human and so on. So you see these transitions there, but another interlocutor for me has been the philosopher Gilbert Simondon, with his theories of individuation and so on, which of course they're quite complex, and maybe we shouldn't go into that now. But essentially, there is a confirmation of this notion that becoming is an entanglement of dimensions of becoming. And when you talk about bodies, well, the first problem is that you should not try to reduce the idea of a body to any one of these dimensions, as if one was more important than the others. I have said many times that yes, you need an organic body to then become a sensorimotor agent, and you need to be a sensorimotor agent to interact socially. Yes, but that's chronology. That's not as relevant as what happens afterwards when all these dimensions are mutually transforming each other, so that our physiology is very much dependent on the jobs we have. For instance, on the urban environment where we live, uh, and on whether we have jobs or not. So that affects our body chemistry, affects our immune system, and so on. So we constantly, all these dimensions are shaping each other. And and so becoming, what does it mean? It's not simply to highlight this process that bodies are unfinished. They're always in a process of arriving, but never arriving. They're always like, okay, uh, let's go to this point, let's go to this point, but then you have to start again.
Mhm.
But it also speaks to, if you like, the more human dimension of becoming, which is the more existential one. Whether you feel that you're living the life you want to live, whether you live in a place that gives you the possibilities to do that, whether you can set yourself goals that you can try to achieve, or whether that's very hard. And then I've done some work on that existential dimension, to show that most of the times we think about it in a very individualistic sense, but in fact, becoming, to make things even more complicated, can only happen, human becoming can only happen in a community, with others.
Also an idea that's really at the roots also of Varela's thinking, no, in many ways.
In many ways, yes, 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 because Varela was also very concerned with such things as well, communities appear in many places, even in the early book, because he talks about observers, but then he says, in fact, we should say a community of observers. He keeps realizing that he has to bring the community, because the community will set a set of rules and norms and interests, that to which you as a researcher would have to somehow connect, either by saying I follow this, or either by saying, look, no, I think we should change, by being critical of them. You can also, but not by being indifferent. So you are shaped by the community, which is also an idea that Simondon has. Like human individuation happens as at the collective level. We become individuals thanks to the collective, not against the collective, which is the traditional
Uh-huh.
way of thinking. It's like, oh, you have the individual and the collective. Like the collective was only the source of obstacles to your individuality. I mean, the collective is also the one, the source of your desires, of your drive, of your powers.
Mhm.
They also come from having developed in this collective. So the idea of becoming becomes quite rich, and that starts to connect opens up what was originally an approach concerned with the study of the mind, or maybe life and mind, to find connections with several interesting questions in 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 the humanities, in social science, in medical sciences, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, you and together with Hannah Dieger, I think this idea of participatory sense making, um, which Andrea also has talked about with other guests in previous conversations, I guess is the enactive attempt and version to understand this social dimension and the way that it's entangled with our organic and sensory motor dimensions of embodiment, as you put it. And you think in the book Linguistic Bodies that you wrote together with Hannah Dieger and Elena Kufari, talk about this primordial tension, as you call it, that is implied by this notion of participatory sense making. And I find this really an interesting idea. So I was wondering if you can say a little bit more
Yeah,
about.
sure. So the work we've done with Hannah on participatory sense making it was, if you like, the first connection that we could establish between these ideas of autonomy, embodiment, sense making with the social domain, with the let's put it in, let's say, interactive domain, where more than one agent is involved in affecting each other. And so what we proposed there, in the context of debates on social cognition, was that at the root of our interactions, there is a way in which we are constantly affecting our sense making. And sometimes it could be an indirect way, like in an interaction, I point to something and you understand that as maybe look in that direction. And now you see something you were not seeing, some influence in your sense making. Two more sophisticated ways in which we can create something together. We're working on a project together, and it's hard to tell who is the author of these ideas, because they're constantly being developed together. So we did apply the enactive trick. So we said, like, okay, we have the autonomy of these individuals and so on, but when is it a social interaction? Well, we suggested that the interaction itself, the dynamics of interaction, momentarily takes an autonomous dynamics too, an autonomous organization too.
Mhm.
And then we ask, well, if that's the case, we should have experiences where the interaction wants to go on, despite everybody wanted to stop it. And we did find those experiences, like the typical case of the narrow corridor situation with two people walking in opposite directions, and then by miscoordination or maybe by coordination, you end up doing this sideways dance for a while until somebody says, "Oh, you first." Well, that's a case in which the interaction, something is becoming self-generating, at least for a moment, temporarily. I'm not saying interaction is an agent or anything like this. It's just this temporary organization. So we then propose that a social interaction should be defined as a situation where we as participants can maintain our autonomy as participants. We are not negated in the encounter. And also, it's not just simply that we're sitting together ignoring each other, but somehow the flow of these dynamics, of these relations, at least momentarily, acquires a life of its own. And in sociology, there were lots of support for the idea of interactions having a life of their own. So what is the primordial tension? Okay, so the primordial tension is exactly, if you like, that tension between these two forms of autonomy, that of the participants and that of the in-between, the encounter. It's not necessarily a tension between people participating. That doesn't have to be a negative connotation to this idea of tension, but we are individual cognizers, embodied cognizers wanting to do things, to do stuff. One of the things we're doing is participating in an interaction. But I may find myself, I don't know, maybe I like to drink some tea now, but I cannot just go and prepare the tea now. So the interaction that we're having now is regulating that desire to say, no, later, you have the tea later. Um, so, or in the middle of interaction, we may have dissonances because I look at somebody behind you that I know of, and you might interpret that as if I'm not paying attention to you. Well, in fact, I am listening to you. But that change that was part of my own sense making, noticing somebody, has had an influence on you and has an influence on the dynamics of interaction. Perhaps from that point on, you start thinking, suspecting that I'm not really taking you seriously in what you're telling me, just because of I had that moment and so on. So the primordial tension is that tension that we have to navigate to work through this potential misunderstandings, these potential dissonances, lack of coordination. And when we do break down the interaction, we had to bring the resources to try to repair it in some way. And that is essentially where we actually learn something new. The interaction is telling us something like, oh, sorry, the typical thing is, sorry, I thought that, whatever. I thought you meant something else. I thought you wanted something else. And then you recover that. And we do it linguistically, but it could be in a dance. It could be people dancing tango that happens to. So the primordial tension is always there. But in the book Linguistic Bodies, what we propose is to start from there and start developing a dialectical understanding of this tension that takes you to increasingly more complex forms of social agency.
Mhm.
Each form of social agency reproduces the original tension in a different way. It resolves it, apparently, but then you realize that, oh, from now on, there is another tension and another tension. And eventually you go from basic participatory sense making, mutual influence in our sense making, to things like acts that regulate how we interact, like gestures and so on, partial acts, we call them, to um, ways in which we regulate how we use those acts with familiar interact participants or unfamiliar ones, to the formation of dialogue, dialogical structures, mutual recognition as participants in the dialogue, and eventually, the possibility of reflecting and utterances in the dialogue. That you say something and I reflect something about what you say, either using the same words or just in the tone or of my response. There's a connection. So the dialogue becomes like a braided history. And that brings several interesting things, consequences, like the possibility of, well, personhood, essentially. Personhood as such becomes theorized in an active approach at that level, when we can recognize each other and we can reflect. Because I can reflect utterances, I can also reflect my own utterances. I can eventually self-talk, have
Mhm.
this self-control that is not just simply self-regulation, like the blood temperature is self-regulating. No, I mean, I have a power which is imbued with social normativity that then I apply to directing my becoming as a person. So that's when we are persons. So that's, sorry, in the end, I ended up talking quite a lot.
But I think we should maybe at some later point do another conversation
Okay,
about
fine, fine.
one thing that or this idea of this tension. I think it connects very well to a comment that I think Shay Welch made with Andrea in an earlier podcast, where she made this interesting point that sometimes it seems like you're actually communicating better with people that have sort of different styles, different perceptions, different ways of
Mm,
being in the world because of the effort that you have to bring into this interaction.
mm,
And I think Rebecca Todd at this point said that, this also shows the importance of love in
mm.
conversation and communicating
Yeah.
successfully. This idea that I think you find also in the work of Erich Fromm, for example, which I really
Mm,
like, that, love is this ongoing practice of
yeah,
trying
yeah.
to engage despite breakdowns, despite tensions. So how do you think about this, since this is a podcast also about love and philosophy?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that's absolutely right. This is also is stepping a little bit into the ethical territory. Well, what should be your attitude if you want to participate and know the other? You can't um, come to this interaction with insufficient openness to the other. You must let the other have their space, their say, and so on. And so to even if that takes a lot of effort, okay, because that typically will take a lot of effort because you think it's so easy, like, I'm open-minded, and then imagine you had to talk to somebody who says, "No, I'm not open-minded." How are you going to be open-minded towards that attitude? And then you have to really try. Okay, so essentially what I'm trying to drive at here is that if you think that our understanding and our becoming advances in communities and through participation, um, if you like, a basic ethical attitude that you have it would be to always attempt to connect and attempt to be open. But that in itself will introduce new tensions. And this is, I mean, Hannah the Year has looked into this engaging epistemology, precisely calling it loving and knowing.
Mhm.
So you should then say, well, I'm not trying to over-determine what's happening here, like coming with preconceived ideas about what you want to tell me, who you are, what you're saying, the meaning of what you're saying. But at the same time, you cannot just simply say everything is fine and disappear into the others that are around you. So that, again, you find that tension, and which is analogous to that original thing we talk about the self or self-production and self-distinction.
Mhm.
In a sense, you are in these interactions forming yourself, producing yourself, if you like, as a human being from all these relations. So you must be open to them, and you must be open to change, and maybe change in directions that are maybe scary. But at the same time, you should also be able to affirm your direction. So becoming is not some simply change, is affirming or attempting to direct or your process of becoming in a good way. And what counts as good is would be a difficult question to ask, but it cannot just be simply good for you because of how you depend on others constitutively, existentially.
Maybe the flip side of this as well that I think also came up in this conversation that I mentioned earlier, which I think they call this idea of complexity fatigue, that maybe sometimes if you're too open to everything at the same
Yeah,
time,
exactly,
it's
exactly, exactly.
becoming very overwhelming. And I mean, I know this from my own experience as someone who I think needs a lot of time to like digest the
Yeah,
conversations, digest different viewpoints, but I'm also always open and wanting to engage. And
yeah.
it's finding this right balance is really difficult.
It is obviously difficult, and there's no recipe for it. That's the difficulty as well, in the sense that yeah, you can get some advice about like, oh, listen to what the others has to say, do not interrupt. Fine, that's fine. But these things never do away with the possibility of full breakdown and misunderstanding that can happen at any time, and not because anybody wants it. Often it happens when everybody's trying to avoid it. That's also one of the reasons why it happens. It's paradoxical. Um, Now, so what does love have to do with it? What's love got to do with it? Okay. Uh, I think okay, there are many different connections, but one is that this openness that would would direct you to what is like good ways to know others and to know anything really. It has the same structure as the one we find when we love uh, somebody, or sometimes more generally, you could love a place, you could love, but in love, you do have that basic existential structure of dependence, openness, but also tension and constant becoming, constant negotiation, constant change. And there must be something that pulls this process forward because sometimes it's just too much work. And
Mhm.
what is it? I mean, well, I think it has to do with the fact that you intuit that in these complex relations, you're also changing yourself to the kind of person you want to be. When it goes like in that direction, sometimes it may not be like that, but sometimes you see that as a possibility, as a potentiality. that then you become, therefore, the person that you desire to be through this complex forms of relations. So that, if you like, that can be extended to all forms of engagement with the world, engagement with nature, engagement with communities, and so on and so forth. And that does not mean, please, this should be obvious, that everything is rosy and great, because suddenly we are kind of open and ready to love everyone. No, no, it's on the contrary. It's what some of the more difficult forms of interaction. And sometimes it just doesn't work. That's the thing. I mean, the good knowledge, like that what Shay was saying also, the effort you put into understanding somebody, just sometimes it does not work. And it breaks down, and that's it. That you tried. Maybe things need to change in order for that to happen again, maybe try again later.
I was wondering how you think how this connects to another theme that I'm very interested in that I also came up in my conversation with Michael Wheeler, which is the idea of authenticity and also being sort of yourself, which is
Yeah,
a very big term.
absolutely. Well, again, it's a really good question, and I wouldn't have a absolutely clear answer. I mean, I have a certain directions because these ideas of becoming that we were talking about already kind of suggest to you that authenticity is not quite rightly conceived as a way of being true to something static, because there is nothing static. I mean, I'm constantly changing. It doesn't mean I'm inauthentic. No, I mean, obviously, it's a tension. When you may be authentic is in that process of becoming you're in a way involved in it. You just simply not being pulled and pushed without you ever bringing yourself into it critically, reflectively, and say, maybe this is not quite right. These things are manifested emotionally before they're manifested consciously as ways of thinking, but emotionally, you know that you're not living through a right situation, something doesn't fit. What is authentic is not necessarily also the self, although that's how the language works, unfortunately. But what is authentic is the form of life in your situation, not just you. So it has to be authenticity also has to be considered relational in
Mhm.
relational terms. And when you look at authenticity also is historical because in past societies, authenticity was not such an issue because you had your place in the world, in medieval times or ancient societies. And to be authentic would be to play that role. You were a farmer, you were something else, you were a soldier, and you just did that. The role defined you. It's just that it's become an issue, with enlightenment and maybe even earlier, in the sense that the individual was put at the center of the inquiry, and then we became very conscious of ourselves as individuals. Um, what is interesting is that I like, for instance, I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like to be true to yourself, you should constantly engage in new artificial changes all the time. That is the way to be true. You don't need to conserve anything. You need to keep on changing. I wish I had the exact quote. So that is interesting because it also speaks of an openness of, if you like, the human essence, paradoxically being something that is not fixed. There's a becoming. And in the article about enactive becoming, I talk about several philosophers who have been looking at becoming, from Renaissance philosophers like Pico de la Mirandola, uh, mid 20th century psychologists like Gordon Allport, uh, people like Paulo Freire, his critical pedagogy and Marxist philosophy and so on. So each of them is telling you something about becoming that is right, but each of them is pointing to what's missing in the other one, and eventually you come to a conception of becoming that I think is quite rich and based on ideas of Simondon and things like that.
How do you think about this in an academic context, or maybe in a reflective context where you have to engage with other people's ideas critically, but also stay true to your own ideas? It's sometimes very difficult because, of course, there's so much information, there's so much to
Yeah.
read, and you find yourself sort of repeating what other people have said and not really sure, is that what I
Mm.
think, or is that what they so. And I mean,
Yeah.
one thing
Yeah.
I find inspiring about your work is that whether or not someone agrees with it, you develop your own kind of positions, also often against mainstream
Mm.
positions, exposing yourself to this kind of criticism. And that's not an easy thing to do. And you have to, I think, have also trust in your own thinking. But there's always, of course, also the possibility that you're wrong and that
Yeah.
and so I was wondering, how do you deal with this? Do you have some kind of advice for people?
I
Um,
think it's a great question, and I think you have to navigate it in each circumstance. Circumstances will be different. There's not like a general thing. But one thing that I think might be general and helpful is to stay true to your questions. To stay true to maybe your question keeps changing shape because the formulations, the things you learn help you formulate it in a different way and so on. But it's something that is driving your interests and your questions and so on. And that you end up knowing these questions so intimately, you want to know really what this means, that there is no, or let's put it this way, that there is little chance that you will be overwhelmed to the point that you abandon them. They can change their shape, but if your question is sincere, authentic, you will not be overwhelmed so much by the information. You may then, if you do it more consciously, you may then understand better whether the information is really that useful for you or not. You say, well, this seems to be about the same issue that I'm interested in, but after reading two lines, I realized that they mean something else. Do I need to really learn all of this? Maybe not right now. Maybe you seek everything, the things that connect most directly to your question,
mhm, mhm,
and speak to you. And you postpone everything else. Of course, the problem is that there are other requirements in an academic life, like you have to be scholarly, you have to know lots of stuff and write lots of papers. Fine, that is difficult.
mhm,
But if you at least want to make sure that you're true to your path, to what you want to do, um, keep asking your central question or questions, and then say, here is something that connects to it. It- Often it's very clear. It's not intellectual, it's emotional. Often it's very clear. You just read some old philosopher that you never heard of, and you suddenly come across a paragraph and say, wow, yes, that's exactly the right way to put it. Who is this guy? uh, and those things are emotional. You just feel them like this aha moment, this thing that hits you. Um, Other times, the opposite is happening. You're dragging on, and it's like, why am I even reading this? Okay, well, perhaps it's not the right time. Somebody told you it's relevant, and maybe they even did that right. If it's such a difficult thing, perhaps you should keep your questions alive, because the real problem is that the whole machinery often will just simply kill your inquiry, will kill the spirit with which you started, and that is a very common problem.
mhm, mhm,
If you keep to the track that you see as the one that is interesting to you and or important to you, um, you you would be likely to be doing the right thing. Um, of course, that doesn't mean your questions cannot change. It doesn't mean that you cannot learn new things and new ideas. That's fine. But it's the same thing. You're enacting, you're bringing forth your academic world, so to speak, and therefore you have to do it right. Not just you know, maybe with a community of people. You have to do it right by being truthful to what's really important to all of you. So I know that that's not very practical advice.
Oh, it's super helpful, I think, and
Yeah.
important also to remember. I was just wondering, are there questions for you that you would say maybe they've somehow been left behind a little bit, that are driving you in the background, but you would like to spend more time thinking about in the future, or are thinking about at the moment?
Oh, I'm sure there are many. Yeah, undoubtedly. I think maybe too many. We didn't mention the word dualism in this conversation, but the inactive approach, it should be clear, it rejects dualistic ways of thinking. Like, oh, you have this on the one hand, and it's very different from that. You have rationality and institutions on one side, and biology drives perception on the other. There may be differences, but there are not big walls. That's the thing that so everything interacts. So, but I'm interested in like, well, okay, what kind of ontology is the right ontology for serving as the basis for this way of thinking? And then, of course, it's kind of going to be a kind of process relational ontology and so on. But then, how does it extend to other questions, such as that these ontological uh, ideas will connect to you know, problems such as, you know, environmental emergencies or politics or science, what the problems in science and quantum mechanics, what's going on. And I see all these connections that I find interesting and I've done some work on or have conversations about,
Mhm.
all coming from these very basic questions like what kind of universe is this that we are able to continuously do this creative stuff that that seems to be unfinished and that when we do stuff is changing. So interesting. I like to understand that better.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's a big task. I guess you still have a
Well,
lot.
yeah, you asked for a question that continues over time. It is a big one. Yes.
Yeah. I think we probably have to come to an end
Okay.
soon because my attention span is running out. But is there anything that we didn't mention that you would have loved to talk about?
No, no, no. I think we covered a lot. Happy.
Oh, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Right.